Clean up your room. Clean up your room. Clean up your room. Clean up your room. That's a good start. Organize your local landscape. Schedule your time.
Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me, Douglas Lane. And once again, I'll be taking some time to debunk the ideas of Jordan Peterson. I'm doing this because Peterson's recent video for Prager U not only makes his ideological commitments perfectly clear, but more importantly, spells out in a very concise way the foundational ideas of what I call the anti-social justice warrior right. A great many people enjoy and admire Peterson for his Jungian mysticism and his cozy homespun wisdom, but his recent video for Prager U puts all of that aside and instead delivers the talking points of the intellectual dark web, which turns out to be a mainstreamed John Birch Society right. But before I begin with refuting and debunking, I want to let you know that Zer0 Books is working on releasing a second edition of Kill All Normies with a new introduction from Angela Nagle. The new intellectual dark web exists on a diet of liberal outrage and failure. When we abandon our own radical aims, we arm our class enemies. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the first minute or so of Jordan Peterson's Prager U extravaganza, Dangerous People Are Teaching Your Kids.
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. They are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself, which they regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal.
The first thing to note about Peterson's narrative is that it is a story with villains. This is a tale of the enemy within, the commie under the bed, and the intellectual as a secret agent of destruction.
According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. It's a great brainwashing process.
But again, pointing out that this is a paranoid narrative, one that blames a conspiracy for social problems, isn't enough. The trick is to find what's true in the anti-social justice warrior criticism and sort that truth out from the misstatements, distortions, and oversimplifications that make their way into the story in order to paper over the problems that the anti-social justice warriors want to ignore. Peterson claims that college professors have made it their mission to undermine Western civilization itself. And upon first hearing this accusation, most people probably think they know exactly what he means. Without really considering it, most will assume he means that these professors want to undermine the United States, the UK, maybe the EU. But does Peterson really think of the EU as an institution representing Western civilization? Is he advocating for the governments of the US and the UK? Maybe he isn't talking about nations at all, but values. Western values like the love of democracy and freedom. Values summed up in the slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But then later on in the video, he'll point to the notion of equality as potentially dubious, a tool of the enemy. The truth is that Western civilization is an ill-defined concept. It arose during the Renaissance, during the 14th century in Italy, and is associated with a rising humanism, an embrace of the empirical sciences, and the slow disintegration of Christendom and feudal society. Strangely, the advent of the notion of Western civilization, one that anachronistically reached back into the past of the Mediterranean in order to find its origins in a Greece that at the time extended into Libya, Syria, and Turkey, came into existence through the slow disintegration of the political, cultural, and economic arrangements that had defined the Christian world for 10,000 years. Again, the idea of Western civilization was subversive when it arrived, which is perhaps why the invention of Western civilization revived the reputation of Socrates, a philosopher who you might recall was put on trial and then put to death for being a danger to the social order and for subverting the minds of the Athenian youth.
But Socrates, the verdict was death. Death? You gotta be kidding me. For what? For teaching the youth wisdom? Well, I'll take it all back.
Okay, back to Peterson.
Regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting ideologues who claim that all truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists, pushing progressive activism at a college near you. They produce the mobs that violently shut down campus speakers, the language police who enshrine into law use of fabricated gender pronouns, and the deans whose livelihoods depend on madly rooting out discrimination, where little or none exists.
It's interesting to note that Peterson's complaint about the radical professors of today is twofold and self-contradictory. On the one hand, he complains about political correctness on college campuses, and on the other, he accuses radical professors from the 60s of bringing subversive ideologies into the university. This is a conflation. He's assuming that political correctness is, in some sense, radical. He's claiming that political correctness represents a conscious attempt to subvert the status quo, and that it intentionally causes disruptions by fueling resentment. But this is a complete misunderstanding of political correctness. A sometimes member of the intellectual dark web, Professor Glenn Lowry at Brown University gave a more adequate description of political correctness back in 1993 when he was a member of the American Enterprise Institute, an organization that supports people like Christina Hoff Sommers and Charles Murray.
That expressing oneself in a certain way conveys some larger meaning. And when we find people who willfully choose not to follow the convention, we're prepared to draw a conclusion that, in effect, they don't share the value which is symbolically reflected in that particular conventional form of expression. It's the fact that it really is informative about the kind of person that I'm talking with to see whether or not they're prepared to labor over the gender pronoun, the third person singular, he or she. See, what makes this work is that everybody says he or she, or something like that. Right? Or they have some tortured paragraph in the foreword about how they've, dealt with the question. And because they do that, my not doing it is informative about me. What does it cost me to go along with the convention? Certainly very little if I indeed embrace the value that the convention is reflective of. What kind of person labors over African American, labors over he or she? Defends at great length the abuse of the language which is now upon us because of all of this politically correct expression. Well, the only kind of person who's prepared to do that is somebody who doesn't hold the value. I put that forward as an empirical statement.
The tactics of political correctness are not radical at all, but conservative. The language policing and attempts to weed out discrimination of all types isn't really aimed at transforming social life, but in protecting values that are presumed to have already been established. After all, it's 2018. Why should we still tolerate James Damore, or even Jordan Peterson, as they enter the public arena? The story goes that Damore and Peterson are violating, questioning central tenets and accepted wisdom. To allow them to speak is not only dangerous to vulnerable people, it is threatening to the stability of society. Especially in the age of Trump, this is the power that political correctness aims to wield. It is an attempt to protect the anti-racist, anti-sexist values that we've learned must be embraced if the words all men are created equal are to mean anything, and that must be held to if liberty, equality, and fraternity are going to be more than mere buzzwords for a repressive order. The problem, of course, is free and open debate in the public forum is of central importance to what we call Western civilization, but what we might now call modernity, or some other word, as these values neither originated in the West, nor are they the property of the West, but have spread through the whole world.
Their thinking took hold in Western universities in the 60s and 70s, when the true believers of the radical left became the professors of today. And now we rack up education-related debt, not so that our children learn to think critically, write clearly, or speak properly, but so they can model their mentor's destructive agenda.
Here's one thing that we should grant Peterson. Many 60s radicals did retreat into the universities in the 70s and 80s, and many did embrace so-called postmodern thinkers like Derrida and Foucault. However, this move was not the act of dedicated and frothing true believers, but was a move of disillusioned rebels who finally decided to grow up and get with the existing program. That's not to say that the long march through the institutions wasn't a strategy of really existing Marxist radicals in the 60s, and that isn't to say that many of them didn't try to remain faithful to what they thought of as a revolutionary project. But it is to say that along the way, the tactics and ideologies of the New Left became more and more conservative. These radical professors became the managers of what is, the ideologues of the present. I'll give you an example. Back in 2013, I interviewed Professor T.J. Clark about his essay, For a Left with No Future. Clark had been a member of the Situationist International back in the 60s, a group that considered itself to be revolutionary and anti-Bolshevik, and a group that often took credit for the student worker riots and strikes that shook France in May of 1968. I think there's been a sense in the last couple of years, especially since 2011, that maybe there would be an opportunity to work beyond that level, to work beyond the level of party politics or taking power within this system. The Arab Spring, and then all of the movements through Europe and, culminating in Occupy kind of gave us a sense that we were going to be at least starting a process towards a true transformation, something that would get us outside of this system. At least that was what I wanted. And I admit I saw it that way because I wanted it that way. But I kind of feel like we replayed 1968 in 2011, only, on the internet and TV, and we're back now facing another kind of failed attempt. Was that informing your? I mean, you wrote this right around that time.
Well, it's certainly the case that obviously behind everything I wrote in For a Left with No Future was a sense of how extraordinary it is that you had such a colossal near catastrophe of the global capitalist system, and out of it did not emerge, a post-capitalist spring. Capitalism went into crisis, but sort of its institutions stabilized themselves, and left politics, by and large, found no resonance. So that's obviously behind everything I'm saying and trying to think through. What would it take then for left politics to have resonance, right? To open towards a future that led us away from the same old options. Greece, I think, is still our, very potent example. And what I would say about the Greek situation is that it's very, very interesting that Syriza finds itself faced by an apocalyptic right-wing alternative, right? With this horrifying name, Golden Dawn, right? The absolute epitome, right? It's about dawn is about to happen, right? Daybreak, a breakthrough into a new day, and that's the language of the apocalyptic left and the apocalyptic right, and it's that language and that set of assumptions about what radical revolutionary change might involve, what image of history and human action it might be premised on. It's that, I think, that my essay is sort of trying to dispute.
The truth is that the New Left and its children in the universities no longer want to undermine or subvert Western civilization, even, as was the case in the past, including during the Russian Revolution, in order to more fully realize the values that emerged slowly during the Renaissance. Instead, what we see are competing forms of conservatism. We are in the middle of a culture war, a merry-go-round of a screaming contest about what values within the present are definitive and about just what we need to do in order to assure that things remain the same. And each side of this culture war points to the past, either to the horrific and genocidal reign of the fascists in Italy and Germany, or to the brutal suppression and starvation associated with Stalinism and Maoism, in order to warn against any attempt at a radical break, and in order to stave off any major transformation. Okay, so I only managed to cover 1 minute of Peterson's Prager U video here. Hopefully in the next video, I'll cover more ground in less time. In the meantime, leave a comment below. What do you think about the potential for a radical break? Am I underestimating the risks from the right and undervaluing attempts to preserve decency and politeness? Or if you're a Peterson fan, am I a dirty, rotten commie deploying brainwashing techniques in order to confuse regular Americans and usher in chaos? Let me know. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, then you should click on that like button. And while I'm plugging things, I'll encourage you to look for our books online, at your local bookstore, or at your local library. Maybe check out The Writing on the Wall, or Kill All Normies. They're both worth reading. You might also click subscribe, because YouTube sometimes tells our subscribers when we put up a new video. Finally, if you're not a patron of our insider podcast called Inside Zer0 Books, you should be. Support us on Patreon today